21st century.
The new paradigm shift.
Yes, it is. Okay, I'm not sure why it's showing this grid like this. Hold on. Let me figure this out. And then my problem is I'm trying to allow people in. Hold on. Sorry, everybody. I'm going to pause just for a second as I figure out how to admit people and share my screen at the same time. Because once I'm in the, I'm paused. So once I'm in here admitting people, it won't allow me to share my screen.
So why don't you just share your screen, then bring the people in?
Let me see if I can allow them just, I'll disable the, okay, I've disabled the weight room and I will now go back.
Good afternoon.
On mute.
All right, so resume slideshow. Why does it want to go there like that? Okay. All right, is that better?
That's got it.
All right, so do I back up or go forward?
No, I'll just start from right there.
Okay, great.
Much of Black history.
Hold on, though. I'm sorry. Just 1 second. I need to start the recording back. You guys, you're going to have to forgive me.
That's all right. You're doing wonderful.
And we're right here with you, so you're doing fine.
Okay, well, now it means I got to go back and start the recording again. All right. There we go. Okay, Dr. Taylor.
All right, thank you. Much of Black history in the U.S. has been painful, but it is precisely when things seem so depressing that we are to remember our history and the sacrifices that our forebears made to enable us to gather here today. Go ahead with the slide, please. Mahalia Jackson sang, "We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord." Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," told us to always praise the bridges that carried us over. Praise the great bridges like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King, but also to praise the smaller bridges like our parents and grandparents who taught us that when we combine faith with action, that great things are still possible. By honoring them, we honor the best in ourselves. Our history is our story, and we need to tell that story in our own voice. The voices of our ancestors remind us that there still must be singing in the dark times. Contrary to popular opinion, the African-American journey did not begin with slavery, but in Africa, the birthplace of civilization. According to the world's most prominent paleoanthropologists and genetic scientists, Blacks, like all other human beings, trace their roots back to Africa. When we celebrate African culture, we're celebrating the oldest and richest culture on earth. There were many African kingdoms founded on the continent of Africa during antiquity, with some growing into very powerful empires. All of these great empires had majestic palaces, great wealth, thriving trading networks, architectural marvels, and a decent standard of living for their subjects. They were truly great civilizations in every aspect, and each was founded and ruled by Africans. Historian Frank Snowden, in his well-researched book, Before Color Prejudice, points out that there was a time before racial prejudice that Africans were among the most admired people on the planet. The Greeks fell in love with Africa and called the Ethiopians the favorite of the gods. Alexander the Great built his grand city, Alexandria, in Africa, and when he died, he was buried in Africa. What was so consequential about the interactions between Africans and Europeans during this period was that racism was not an issue. Skin color never defined the relationship, even when both Rome and later Greece conquered Egypt, or when the Arabs and African Moors conquered Spain. The type of racial prejudice that Black people face today was to emerge later during the European enslavement era. During antiquity, Africa led the world for thousands of years and achieved phenomenal success. Professor Ivan van Sertima, a leading authority on African history, says, "It is not necessary for us to create new myths about Africa. The truth itself is more astonishing than any myth we could create." Now, if it's true that Africa is the birthplace of humanity, then why not start our history classes there and teach about the ancient migration out of Africa, then add other strands of the human family as they arrive on the scene, rather than pretending that civilization started in Greece. By disconnecting the world from its African birthplace, Europeans effectively disconnected all of us from each other. Now, when Blacks migrated out of Africa, they left their footprints all over the planet, from India to Australia to the Americas. And without challenging the history that we've been taught, students are left without a clue as to how Aborigines reached Australia, or why pyramids in Mexico looked eerily similar to the ones found in Egypt. And no matter how much ice piled up during the Ice Age, you need a boat to reach Australia from Africa, which meant that Africans built ships. And if they can sail to Australia, they can sail to America and Mexico and Europe. Seafaring wasn't yet the domain of Europeans back then. We now know that African kings sent numerous ships to explore the world. There are over 10,000 Pacific islands that are populated by Black people. In fact, the further we go back in history, the Blacker it becomes. Dr. Sertima says we can no longer cast a blind eye to the genius of the Africans. It is only by having an open eye that the true history of Africa can be revealed. And because of the African migration, Asia and Europe also had an African presence. Scientists claim that the oldest Briton skeletal remains found was that of a dark-skinned person called Cheddar Man with curly hair and African roots. Similar skeletal remains were found in other parts of Europe, and they also had darker skin and some with blue eyes. European explorers were shocked when they found that many of the Eskimos were as black-skinned as the darkest African. Now, despite this overwhelming DNA evidence, many white scholars are still reluctant to admit an African connection. Recent genetic research has firmly established that early Africans possessed all of the genes that humankind possesses, which simply means our early ancestors had woolly hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, brown eyes, were tall or short, and so forth, that emerged thousands of years after thousands of years of evolution to match the climate and environment that they migrated to. I would simply urge skeptics to trust the science. DNA research coupled with anthropology and history are helping us understand the past with a clearer view. Unless someone is completely biased, this new information based on science is pretty convincing. But how do you change the consciousness of Americans and pierce through centuries of racist thinking about Africa? It's difficult even today to get most Americans to accept that possibility, because if we admit the truth about Black people's grand past, chattel slavery based on racial inferiority could never have been justified. White superiority would be exposed as a myth, and all of our history books would need to be rewritten. Unfortunately, nearly every ancient civilization that has been identified in the West has been denied its African roots, despite breathtaking facts to the contrary. The ancient Olmec civilization that was prominent in what is now Mexico from 1200 BC to 400 BCE is a great example. The Olmec civilization was one of the most advanced of its time and was the forerunner of all subsequent Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya and Aztecs. Their beautiful multicultural cities rivaled any on the planet. Multiple heads of colossal sculptors with their African features were found in Olmec civilization ruins. And some scholars claim it's difficult to determine their ethnic origins, despite their African features, despite oral histories confirming African presence and many legends about Blacks in Olmec culture. Some have gone as far as to say that these great sculptures had to be created by UFOs. That's right, UFOs, unable to face the obvious. But those days of arrogantly dismissing African contributions are numbered, because we now have serious and objective scholars who are following the truth no matter where it leads them. And presently that truth suggests that all roads lead back to Africa. It's important to understand that the only reason we have this new scholarship is because of Black student protests in the 60s demanding ethnic studies programs and African-American history programs at our universities. As a result, we have over 50 years of excellent scholarship uncovering the truth about our past and are filling in the historical gaps of Black history. Young scholars are using archaeological, linguistics, genetic, skeletal, anthropological, and primary source data to provide a clearer picture of this window into our past. And what a story that is emerging. And someday this new discovery of old knowledge will be known by the public and taught in our schools. That is my hope. You see, the first encounter Europeans would have had with Africans was seeing them as explorers, warriors, government emissaries, or traders, certainly not as savages. And this lie about savages is so deeply embedded in American psyche and culture that many people really think that Tarzan existed. If they only knew that in antiquity, there were places that if you were a Black person, you would want to be thrust back in time to enjoy these great multicultural cities, because this was a time when Blackness was centered and respected around the globe. From Fez to Genoa, one more slide, please. There were many great African cities that rocked, and skin color was only a descriptive term. No, it wasn't perfect harmony, and many people were persecuted. But historians note that one's treatment in society was not based on race. Can we imagine such a world like that happening today? Better yet, how do we get back to that world in which skin color is only a descriptor? The ancients have much to teach us. Because of Africa's prominence on the world stage, foreigners were drawn to its shores and enticed by the lure of gold and other riches. An elaborate 14th century map called the Catalan Atlas featured a prominent illustration of Mansa Musa seated on a plush throne, crowned in gold, holding a scepter in one hand and a large golden orb in the other. This Moorish ruler, reads the map's description, is the richest and most distinguished ruler of this whole region on account of the great quantity of gold that is found in his lands. Tales of King Mansa Musa's trek to Mecca and his display of enormous wealth became legendary in both European and Arabian countries. It was this desire for gold that led the Portuguese to Africa, where they were able to get a foothold into West Africa and become the first Europeans to market in enslaved Africans in the 15th century. And after Columbus stumbled on the Americas, Portugal and Spain wasted no time in setting up sugarcane plantations that required an unlimited labor supply, since the average lifespan of a sugarcane worker was about 7 years. And when they decided they would get their labor supply from Africa, the European transatlantic slave trade was launched, and the raping of our ancestral home began. Now, the Europeans, in all fairness, could not have enslaved Africans without African complicity. And we have to be honest. Arab enslavers had already set up a slave trade with African kings. And that explains in part why African kings didn't resist European enslavers initially, until much later after finding out about chattel slavery. Because Africa had such linguistic and cultural diversity, there was no allegiance to a continent or to Black people per se. There was no African nationalism back then. So this made it easy for Europeans to pit one nation against the other. In this sense, Africa was no different from white Europeans who were at constant war with each other. At this time in history, neither white skin nor black skin determined one's loyalty, but treachery was Europeans' most potent weapon. That is, getting Africans to engage in civil wars by arming them and sharing the wealth with them in return for African kings supplying them with a continuous supply of captives. This enriched some African kingdoms, but ultimately led to a vicious cycle of destruction. Europeans could not be trusted and would double-cross African kings at will. Now, African captives that were living in the interior were marched to the coast, a journey that could be as long as 300 miles. And they placed yokes around their necks so they could be chained together and to prevent them from escaping. Captives were brought to slave-holding forts on the West Coast, which were dark, damp, disease-ridden dungeons that would make Dracula's castle look like a five-star hotel. These fortresses became known as the point of no return. Africans were taken from these places out to the slave ships resting in the harbors. Many leapt to their deaths rather than leave their native country. Many thought that whites were cannibals and that they would be taken to the land of the cannibals and eaten. The utter devastation of Africa during the slave trade can never be understated. Furthermore, only Africa's finest and fittest were enslaved. The sick, disabled, and elderly, who were least able to contribute to the economic health of their countries, were left behind to fend for themselves. Africa was robbed of over 25% of its population. Now, no nation on earth could withstand that type of internal destruction. Once Portugal and Spain established the profitability of the African slave trade, other European nations, including Britain, entered the field. Some 12.5 million Africans were shipped from Africa, but only 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. The voyage over left a trail of corpses too numerous to count. Over 2 million human lives are unaccounted for, probably lost at sea. Now, whatever the ocean route taken, conditions on board the slave ships were horrific. Africans were shackled in chains, stacked like sardines in the ship's hull, with less than 18 inches between the ceiling and floor, not enough space to sit up in. The enslaved were segregated by gender. Adult men were shackled and kept below deck. Women were left unbound in another area of the ship, and children often had free run of the ship. Women were brutally raped, and many arrived at the New World pregnant. The average trip from Africa to the Americas took just over 2 months, with many lasting 3 months. Most of the space on a slave ship was occupied by casks of water. You might be able to survive up to 2 weeks without food, but you wouldn't last 3 days on that ocean without water. Slave ships had weapons mounted on deck in case there was an insurrection. And before boarding, captives were stripped of their clothing and had their heads completely shaved to avoid head lice. Netting was installed on the side of the ships to catch those Africans who would rather jump in the ocean to a certain death rather than becoming a slave. The slave ships almost always carried more Africans than the cramped space would allow, as it was expected that up to 15% would die or be killed trying to escape during the voyage over. And those who died en route were thrown to the sharks that always followed slave ships. Slave ships had names like John the Baptist, Liberty, Brotherhood, Gift of God, and Jesus. The so-called Christian enslaver had to lie to themselves that they were involved in God's work in bringing heathens into civilization. And approximately 1 out of 10 slave ships experienced resistance. 55 detailed accounts of mutiny were recorded between 1699 and 1845. The only way that enslavers could get Africans on those ships was to force them, because many of the enslaved males and quite a few females were warriors captured in battle, and Africans have always resisted their oppression. They resisted on the way to the slave ships, on the ships, off the ships, in every way they could, because free people never forget their freedom. And despite the myth that Columbus discovered America, we know that there were millions of people in the Americas speaking over 300 distinct languages when Columbus arrived. There were kings and prophets, governing councils and communal clans. There were fishermen, farmers, and buffalo hunters, weavers, potters, and rock painters, healers, spiritual leaders, builders, and teachers. And today, nearly all of these great languages and people are gone. That's Columbus's legacy. If truth be told, Columbus was the savage in the way that he enslaved, raped, and massacred thousands of indigenous people. That's why honest and inclusive history is needed in our schools, so we can set the historical record straight. After Europeans decided to colonize this country, vast numbers of people were needed to work the land. Europeans started by enslaving natives to clear the land. Because European diseases, massacres, and wars resulted in the deaths of millions of native people, other labor sources were needed. So they settled primarily on two choices. One, they decided to use a system that was in place in England, the indentured servant system, to bring white servants to the New World in exchange for their labor for 4 to 7 years. And nearly 2/3 of the white population in the 13 American colonies came via way of the indentured system. Secondly, they turned to Africa. And when Europeans brought the first Africans to the British colony in America in 1619, they too were treated as indentured servants because slavery was not legal in colonial law at that time. During the indentured period, poor whites and blacks had a unique bond based on a shared oppression. They got along quite well and even intermarried. For a brief period in our history, class differences may have been more significant than racial differences, and the promise of freedom became a reality for some blacks. However, Bacon's rebellion that united black and white colonists against the governor of Virginia ended the indentured servant system for blacks. Rich planters learned from Bacon's rebellion that poor whites had to be forever separated from poor blacks. So they divided and conquered by creating a buffer based on race. They passed laws making blacks slaves for life. In exchange for their support of the new slave policy, lower class whites won new entitlements from the planter elite. So no matter how low a white person was on the economic scale, his or her white skin made him better off than blacks. And the goal was to offer just enough racial privileges for white workers to identify with their skin color instead of their class. It worked then, and it still works today. By the early 18th century, every Virginia county had a militia of landless poor whites ready in case of any sudden eruption of Indians or insurrection by blacks. The rich planters effectively ended the class unity of poor people and replaced it with racial animosity that unfortunately exists to this day and has been exploited by politicians ever since, with Trump just being the latest. Now just imagine if poor whites and blacks could have taken over Virginia back then. We might have a different America today. And as the indentured system morphed into slavery for blacks, white attitudes towards blacks began to shift. They began to stereotype Africa as backwards and uncivilized, and amnesia set in. They forgot the Moors from Africa had brought to Spain and Europe much of the learning that led to the Renaissance. They forgot Timbuktu in Africa, with its renowned university and library, was the center of learning for numerous Greek scholars. They forgot that Egypt has influenced every civilization known to humankind, and they disavowed their own connection to their African ancestry. And as slavery became more defined by race, the racial concepts of whiteness and blackness became more pronounced until blackness and enslavement were interchangeable. Whites then passed laws making blacks chattel property. As such, blacks were sold, bartered, rented, deeded, used as collateral and treated worse than farm animals. Children were routinely snatched from their mother's arms and sold. Frederick Douglass said, "We have worked without wages, we have lived without hope, wept without sympathy, and bled without mercy." The Supreme Court enshrined this racist thinking into the law in its 1857 Dred Scott decision, ruling that Black people, whether enslaved or free, came from a quote unquote slave race and had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. This belief became the root of the endemic racism that we still cannot purge from this nation to this day. Now, despite living under such inhumane conditions, Blacks fought and died in every war for America. When Paul Revere rode through the countryside waking up Minutemen, he woke up Black Minutemen as well. When George Washington crossed the Delaware River, Blacks were in the boat with him. We've marched in every war, but when they signed the Constitution, Black lives were only worth 3/5 of a white person's life. Up until 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade was finally outlawed, most of the enslaved came from Africa. After the transatlantic trade ended, the majority of the enslaved were born in the US and became part of the domestic slave trade. Now, most history books just gloss over the domestic slave scene as if it was insignificant, but in reality, it was far larger than the transatlantic trade and just as pernicious. When the US outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, you would have thought that the slaveholding states would have launched a civil war back then over that decision. And there are several reasons why there was so little opposition from slaveholding states. One was that the transatlantic slave trade continued illegally, but perhaps the more important reason was that slavers wanted to protect their domestic slave breeding and slave trading business from their transatlantic competition. Thomas Jefferson did more to promote domestic slavery and slave breeding than any other president and got rich doing it. More than 1 million Blacks were sold to slavers in the Deep South from Virginia, Maryland, and other slave states during the domestic slave trade. And that's double the amount that was brought from Africa. Whether brought here or born here, the average enslaved Black person did not take slavery lying down. They resisted in every way they could. Slave escaping was so prevalent that it forced Congress to pass the Fugitive Slave Act. There were many slave rebellions and Black heroes that fought for emancipation. Harriet Tubman, called Moses by her people, led hundreds of Blacks to freedom. She said, "If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop, keep going. If you want to taste the freedom, keep going." But perhaps what really kept the Black masses going and from going insane during slavery was the church. Faith was all that the enslaved had to sustain them, and the church was their rock. The church gave the enslaved dignity and assured our forebears that they were loved and equal in the eyes of God, that no matter how unbearable their suffering was, Jesus, who too suffered, had prepared a place of rest for them when their time was up on earth. It was this religious faith that enabled them to endure their bondage. The church also served as a launching pad for emancipation. Nearly every slave rebellion was planned in the Black church. Nat Turner was a minister, as was Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Presser. It was in the Black church where our ancestors prayed for slavery's end after a brutal civil war. The Civil War saw Blacks fighting for their own freedom, and the colored troops excelled in battle. Lincoln admitted that the war could not have been won without the colored troops, and he supported Black veterans having the right to vote before he was assassinated. But the Civil War was deadly for Blacks, with disease causing more death than battle. More Black women and children succumbed to the epidemic than men. There are countless references to freed women dying on the side of a road, in abandoned barns, or on a deserted battlefield. They died without us knowing their names or even hearing a sentence about how they planned to celebrate their freedom. Many of them simply starved to death. Professor Jim Downs, in his book, Sick from Freedom, believes that about 1 million Blacks died during this period, and our history books don't even mention their passing. They suffered in life and were forgotten as if they never lived in death. Oh, freedom. At the end of the Civil War, there were still enslaved Blacks in Texas and Oklahoma. So when General George Granger and the colored troops rode into Galveston, Texas, one can imagine the joy in the hearts of our enslaved ancestors. The record tells us when they heard the news of freedom on June 19, 1865, they alternately sang, danced, and prayed. There was much rejoicing and jubilation that their lifelong prayers had finally been answered. Many of the enslaved left their masters immediately upon being freed in search of family members, economic opportunities, or simply because they could. They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and hope in their hearts. Oh, freedom. As Blacks emerged from this long, dark night, there was this great promise that for the first time since they had been in this land, the US Constitution would protect them. Blacks were looking forward to becoming US citizens. Many freedmen gave themselves new names. County courthouses were overcrowded as Blacks applied for licenses to legalize their marriages. There was a run on educational primers as Blacks sought the education that had for so long been denied them. Schools were established and joined churches as centers of the newly freed communities. The promise of emancipation gave freed men and women optimism for the future, but few realized that slavery's bitter legacy was just beginning to unfold and that equality was to remain an elusive dream. Frederick Douglass said, they freed us, but they didn't change their attitude about us. Ex-slaves found for the most part they were left to fend for themselves. Ex-slaves were, as Frederick Douglass said, free without roofs to cover them, or bread to eat, or land to cultivate, and as a consequence, died in such numbers as to awaken the hope of their enemies that they would soon disappear. They were freed without an economic base to make emancipation real. They never received 40 acres and a mule. Black people all over the South were pleading with Union officials, do not abolish slavery and leave us landless. Do not force us to work for our former masters and call that freedom. Just give us some land and we'll be okay. Now keep in mind, these newly freed Blacks were highly intelligent blacksmiths, shoemakers, carpenters, artisans, musicians, farmers, midwives, overseers, house managers, cooks, and gardeners. It was their skill set that made those plantations entirely self-sufficient. All they needed was land. And while Blacks were begging for land, the 1862 Homestead Act signed by President Lincoln gave away millions of acres west of the Mississippi, primarily to whites. And when the Civil War ended, slave owners acted like they had won the war. The ink from Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox had barely dried when Southerners returned to their state houses and immediately enacted Black codes. These laws restricted Black people's right to own property, conduct business, and buy land. The Black codes, for all practical purposes, reinstituted slavery all over the South. See, it's important to understand the true story of history because more Americans have learned the story of the South from Gone with the Wind than from actual factual history books. The period after the Civil War ended is known as Reconstruction because the South had to be rebuilt and the country had to be reunited. During the early years of Reconstruction, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner who was considered to be one of America's worst presidents, became president after Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson allowed the Black codes to take effect in the South and permitted many of the Confederate leaders to return to their old positions of power. Johnson turned a blind eye to the violence his Southern allies perpetrated against Blacks. But fortunately, the Republicans in Congress had seen enough and heard the cry of the freedmen, and they introduced their version of Reconstruction over Johnson's vetoes. The Republicans divided the South into 5 military districts and sent federal troops to protect the rights of newly freed Blacks. Republicans then passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Reconstruction Amendments that abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and gave Blacks the right to vote. They also created the Freedmen's Bureau to provide relief services for former slaves. During Reconstruction, and with the protection of federal troops to secure their voting rights, over 1,500 Black politicians were elected all over the South, including senators and governors. But instead of envisioning a world where Black men and women could live as equals and in dignity with the majority population, the rise of Black political power triggered a violent Southern white backlash that eventually destroyed Reconstruction. Ex-Confederates founded the Ku Klux Klan and vowed to never accept Blacks as social equals. They pledged to take their country back, to redeem the South and make it great again. Does that sound familiar? Because of this violent resistance, most of the gains that Blacks made during Reconstruction vanished. Through the Compromise of 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South and Reconstruction ended. The Southern Democrats, now called the Redeemer Party, took control of most Southern state houses. They defunded public schools, closed public hospitals, and eliminated the safety net that was set up during Reconstruction. They passed numerous voting suppression laws, and the KKK and other white militia groups murdered and terrorized Blacks from office, returning local, state, and federal offices to all white institutions. And why didn't we learn that in our history classes? At the same time, a reactionary Supreme Court ended Black civil rights protection. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the court institutionalized both racism and segregation. It is directly responsible for the era of Jim Crow that followed. When Northerners abandoned Blacks to the will of former Southern Confederates, sharecropping and the convict lease system replaced slavery. The convict lease system let Southern states arrest Blacks and hire them out indefinitely without a trial, without pay, to former slave owners and factory owners. Although the 13th Amendment barred slavery except as a punishment for a crime, Southern states used this loophole in the amendment to replace the slave master. In fact, much of the labor to rebuild the South came from convict leasing. In another heart-wrenching case, U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876 ruled that the federal government could not prosecute armed militias like the KKK, the White League, and the Red Shirts because this assault against Black people was a states' rights issue. That decision made lynching commonplace. So this was the other side of emancipation, where high expectations gave way to heart-crushing reality. Now, while Jim Crow laws kept Blacks segregated and unequal in the US, there was a scramble for Africa that ended with European colonization. In 1884, at the Berlin Conference, European countries, along with complicity from the US, literally divided the continent among themselves. They wanted to avoid war with each other while they plotted to colonize Africa. The slave trade had robbed Africa of millions of its best and brightest men, women, and children. Now Africa would lose its mineral wealth as well. Back in America, the end of Reconstruction and the enforcement of Jim Crow laws was tragic enough for Blacks, but few were prepared for what was coming, the nadir of American race relations. Nadir means lowest point, rock bottom, the depth of despair. According to historian Rayford Logan, it described the years between 1877 to 1907 but most scholars extend that period to at least 1940. During the Nader, segregation increased everywhere. Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912 and immediately segregated the federal government. In the Roaring 20s, the KKK rose to its zenith with more than 4 million members and openly dominated the governments of Georgia, Indiana, and Oregon out west. Hundreds of Confederate monuments were built all over the country during the Nader as the lost cause was popularized. During the Wilson and Harding administrations, over 100 race riots took place, more than in any other period since Reconstruction. In 1921, America's Black Wall Street, one of the most prominent concentrations of African-American businesses in the United States, was destroyed. Law enforcement officials used airplanes to drop firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families, massacring hundreds of Blacks and leaving thousands homeless. Historian James Loewen says, it's almost unimaginable how racist the US became during the Nader. From coast to coast, Blacks were attacked and driven out of towns, leaving many all white. Even communities with no Black populations passed laws that threatened Blacks with death if they remained overnight. By the end of the 1960s, there were at least 10,000 sundown towns across the US. 10,000. Can you imagine that? It's important that people understand that the racial oppression Blacks faced during the Nader is directly responsible for the racial disparities we face today. Without a historical backdrop, it's easy to gaslight the victim and conclude that Blacks are themselves solely responsible for their condition. Without our history of segregation, we would need to talk about diversity and inclusion today. It wasn't until World War II, nearly 100 years after the Civil War, that a major positive change occurred for many Blacks. There was a huge demand for workers in the northern defense plants because World War II cut off the flow of white immigrant labor from Europe. So thus began the second great migration from the South to the North by Blacks, resulting in more than 4 million Blacks fleeing from the South. Now, despite the commonly held perception that most Northern citizens embraced racial equality, when Blacks arrived in our northern cities, it wasn't like a welcome mat was extended to these new arrivals. Instead, Black people were prevented either by restrictive deeds, government policy, or straight out violence from buying homes in white neighborhoods. Instead of the promised land, Black migrants found that Jim Crow had made the journey north along with them. They were only allowed to settle in the oldest, most rundown neighborhoods in industrial cities. Professor Loewen argues that the family instability and high crime in Black communities can be traced not to slavery, but to the Nader and its aftermath. When Dr. King led the modern civil rights movement and the Supreme Court finally overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in the Brown versus Board of Education court decision in 1954, Blacks thought that surely racial justice and the promise of freedom would become a reality. But history has shown us that whenever there has been Black progress, a white backlash soon follows. Professor Carol Anderson calls it white rage in her extremely informative book. It didn't take long for Nixon to launch his war on drugs. In her book, The New Jim Crow, author Michelle Alexander documents the devastation that war has wreaked on the Black family and resulted in the US imprisoning more Blacks than any other country in history. The promise of freedom that was envisioned in the 60s was once again deferred as it had been after the indentured servant period, after Reconstruction, and after the Nader. We still remain a divided nation today. And it is out of this total history that we must view Black circumstances in America and the meaning of Juneteenth. While we have made considerable progress since the 60s, as Bill Clinton suggests, the challenge of our past remains the challenge of our future. Despite the election of our first Black president, we are still a nation shaped by segregation and inequality that has its roots in slavery. And I wish I had a happy ending for you, but racism and division has increased over the past 4 years, and the promise of freedom continues to be deferred. That's why we must study history to learn its lessons. Marcus Garvey said, what humans have done, humans can do, but we can't sit passively by and wait for someone else to make things better. President Obama said, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And we must never forget that America is as African as it is European. The American flag also belongs to Blacks who have loved this country without this country ever loving them back. Black people have been in this country before the Pilgrims. They helped build the cities, cleared its forests, fought its wars, and helped save the Union to only be abandoned to the South and subject to horrific violence after Reconstruction. So when we start being honest about Black history, then the past will truly inform us and help us re-envision America from its white supremacist past to its multicultural future. Our history is our story. And if there was ever a time that we needed people to understand that story, that time is now. So let's go forward with hope, knowing the heroic struggle and unrelenting spirit of our ancestors won't allow us to give in to defeat. If the horrific treatment they received didn't crush their spirits, then we too must continue to resist and to sing. And perhaps someday we can help this nation heal the wounds of our troubled past. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this lecture series.
Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.
Yes, that was wonderful. Okay. Kareem?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sade. Thank you, Dr. Teller. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Ashada Sante, Ashada Sante. You have just taken the book From Slavery to Freedom, Before the Mayflower, and a few other Lerone Bennett's, all book. You took all those volumes and put them into a 45-minute presentation, and you did an excellent job.
Well, thank you.
And I truly believe that those that listened to this really was enriched today. And again, we thank you for that. I wanted to first, as we always do, want the listening audience to know a little bit about who Dr. Teller is. What did you grow up at? What inspired you to go into your field that you find yourself endeavor into today?
Well, I grew up in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the same city that Rush Limbaugh grew up in, but of course we were at the opposite polar ends of our political perspective, and remain so even with his death recently. And I grew up in a large family in the poorest part of town, but the people may have been poor, but they were rich in spirit, and they inspired us and told us that we could be whatever we wanted to be if we put in the work. My father was probably the hardest working man that I've ever met. And so I learned my work ethic from him. I went to college. My hometown, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, has a college, Southeast Missouri State. I got my undergraduate degree there, went out west to the University of Oregon. I got my master's, and I got my PhD here in Madison. And I've been in Madison, which is now my home, for the past 35, maybe nearly 40 years. But it was because of people and teachers and loved ones who inspired me along the way. You know, there was always a support group. Even I wrote an article for Facebook because we lived right on the railroad tracks, and hobos would, at that time, that's what we called the homeless, would stop at our door because our house was like, as soon as you get off the railroad tracks, that was our house. And they would stop asking for food. And my father would always feed them. And I always wondered why he was so generous, because we didn't have that much ourselves. Some of you, if you're my age, you remember the Spam and cheese and all that government food. But my father, through his examples and through his life, led me to realize that, but by the grace of God, we all could be in that position. And so it was people like that throughout my whole life, whether they were Black or white, that inspired me and gave me opportunities.
Let me just remind the audience that if you want to ask questions, you can probably formulate them in the chat or just be prepared when we open up.
Absolutely.
Kareem?
Yes, thank you very much. That was also, I too am from Missouri, about an hour up north, up the way from you in St. Louis, Missouri. So I identify with your struggle as well, and I'm of the baby boomers as well.
Okay.
Secondly, I wanted to ask Dr. Teller before we go into the audience and allow them to ask the questions. We want to set the foundation of further questions, but the next, I appreciate, and I know we all did, the part in your presentation where you talked about our people in resistance, the resistance part. Dr. Myers always wanted us during the month of Juneteenth, and he used to always tell me that he wanted some of the cities that during that week for us to take the Death by Hands Unknown or 100 Years of Lynching and other books that talked about our people and what happened to them, to be able to read some of those names. So we are was appreciative of that part that you put in there about the resistance of our people. But what I want to ask you was, you talked about those aspects as to what occurred. And the book that we're asking the individual to read this month is Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of a Negro. And so in that, he talks about the effect of miseducation. So I wanted to ask you that question. Could you give us a brief understanding as to what is the effect of our people being miseducated as opposed to having the knowledge that you just departed with us?
Well, it's not only our people. We saw the effects of miseducation on January the 6th, you know, when they attacked the Capitol in Washington, D.C. If all Americans had some of the education that I tried to lay out this evening, I think we would all benefit, because we've all been miseducated. And the good thing now, you know, a lot of times we look at protests and we say, oh, those, you know, those people are doing this, like the Black Lives movement has been, you know, really torn down by the media. But those kinds of protests are extremely important. When Black students protested back in the 60s, we're benefiting from that protest today. You know, I was in some of those protests, and we were demanding, you know, Black students, Black studies and Black professors and all these kinds of things. And one of the reasons I'm able to be a professor was because somebody else sacrificed back then. And so if we learn our history, we can learn some of the lessons from that history and become not only united as a people, but help save this country.
Thank you, Dr. Teller. So at this time, Dr. Sade, do we have someone from the listening audience that would like to ask a question as we go into our second half of our program?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, go for it.
Announce your name.
Hi, my name is Danielle Green, and I'm a good close friend of Dr. Taylor. He's my hero. Hi, I have
Put too much pressure on me.
I have a question. Dr. Taylor, you spoke about the Freedmen's Bureau doing Reconstruction. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Freedmen's Bureau? I remember watching a documentary about it and how it talked about how a bank was established, and then eventually that bank was pretty much destroyed by white supremacists as they took advantage of bankers, because Blacks were building their own economic base and they were trying to create their own economic wealth and stability within their communities. And then for some reason, that bank just automatically went bankrupt. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the main thing about the Freedmen's Bureau, like most other services that Blacks have been lucky enough to get is they've always been underfunded. So that's number one. There was never enough hospitals. There was never enough land. There was never enough clothes. The Freedmen's Bureau at the time, and if you go back into some of the literature and some of the people that were working for them, they were anti-Black. Now there were some very committed people. I don't want to, brush
You speaking the truth.
I'm sorry. Did somebody say something?
I was saying you're speaking the truth. Keep going.
Oh, okay. But anyway, the Freedmen's Bureau, they started off underfunded. And keep in mind, you had all these southern states that needed these services. Black people in every southern state needed help. And so you may have had a Freedmen's Bureau, say in Memphis, but what about the rural areas? People had to go all the way to certain places to get that help. And so you had vast regions of the country who never got any help. And one of the points that I was trying to make to explain in my talk was, over 1 million people died from diseases that could have been saved, and most of those were Black people. And the banking thing was just sort of one more calamity. People were led to believe that if they put their money in that bank, that it would be secure. That was another lie. And what I would suggest, so that I don't give away everything, is that the book that I'm writing, everything I talked about is going to be expanded, so that you can find out not only details about the Freedmen's Bureau, but probably some information that you didn't know. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit evasive, but I do want to encourage people to not only read my book, but read tons of other books. And what I tell young scholars, that we need your intellect. We need you out here writing history, because until we are able to tell our own story, it seems like right now that the way American history is written, it's like the bad memory of somebody else. And so we need to make sure that we are writing a history from our perspective.
That segues nicely into my question, which is about your book, the next book. And I know you don't want to reveal too much about it, and much of your text or talk today is extractions from the book. But is it designed to be a textbook, and at what grade level are you?
Well, I'm trying to make it this one for the general public. Others, like my first Juneteenth book, was for 12 years and up. But this one I want to make more for the general public, because if you thought some of the history that I try to convey today was valuable, then I think the general public may find it valuable as well, to get a sort of a broad overview of our history. I can't describe everything, because right now it's already 300 pages and I've got to sort of bring it back. But I'm trying to capture as much of our history from antiquity to present day in a way that people will have a better understanding of history, and then they can do their own research. Because right in the introduction, I'm challenging people. I want you to challenge my facts. And if you can prove me wrong, that's fine. But if you can't, then share the book and introduce other people to this history.
So you will have citations and references?
Oh yeah, I've got tons and tons of footnotes.
Okay.
And I was hoping the book may be ready by summer, but realistically, probably early 2022, because there's still tons of editing that's got to be done. Everything has to be fact checked, and then there's photos like the ones that I've shown, but I've got some even better photos, and I've got to get permissions for all the photos, and the whole 9 yards of putting together a book.
Yeah, I'm challenging my chair, who is who is everything to me these days. Dr. Mario Azevedo is the department chair for history and philosophy at Jackson State University. So in the College of Liberal Arts, we're working on a whole lot of wonderful work about outreach and bringing people in. So I just want to invite my chair to just say something, because I would like Dr. Azevedo to probably invite Charles, to come and when the book is published, to perhaps come and do a book signing and speak to some of our classes.
That would be wonderful. Before he speaks, Now, keep in mind, I'm supposed to be retired. So
That doesn't happen.
I keep trying to remind people of that, but they won't let me retire. So
What you retiring from? A struggle. We never retire from the struggle.
that's true.
That's true.
Come on, Doc, because I'm gonna come back with Dr. Taylor. Come on, Doc.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Turnipseed. I always have a problem.
Oh, I told you, just call me Sade because you
Sade.
keep messing up my name.
Turnipseed. Turnipseed. It's a beautiful name. That's why it's difficult to pronounce. I thank you for inviting me to attend this. I'm glad that this is Sunday and I was able to be present. The lecture of Dr. Charles Taylor, I must say, it was brilliant. I was listening to everything, and the visuals that you gave us just made your presentation one of the best that I have ever seen in the United States.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for volunteering to do this.
Now, if I could just briefly interrupt you, sir.
Yes.
One of the parts that I left out, because when I first practiced the speech this week, it was like an hour and 15 minutes. So I had to throw out a whole lot of stuff. And one of the pieces that I threw out was the Underground Railroad in the South and Mexico's role in the Underground Railroad and all that. And I really wanted to talk about that because, you know, as people of color, we fail to realize that our histories are connected.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of coalition historically that we have been engaged in.
Right.
And once people learn that, and again, that will be included in the book. But I think once people are aware of that, even the collaboration with Native tribes and Blacks and Mexicans and Natives and Blacks, all that history is so rich and so valuable.
Thank you very much. And I wish we had kids, our students, to attend this lecture. I hope
We're going to get them on.
Okay, very good. One comment that I wanted to hear from you, Dr. Taylor, I'm originally from Africa. From Mozambique. You talked about the Portuguese who were the first ones to perhaps enslave the Africans. We have a very rich history, the Africans.
Yes.
Right now, things are just not going well. And we have the resources there. We have educated Africans, scientists that can transform the continent. Why is it that we're still behind everybody? What do you think are the priorities that African leaders in particular should have in your estimation, in your perspective?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but historically, you know, Africa has been raped of its resources and its people, both mineral and human. And so countries, you can't recover from that. Sometimes it takes centuries to recover from that. But what I will say is Africa still has most of the world's resources, which means that it has the capability of recovering to its greatness. Maybe certainly not in our lifetimes, but 50 to 100 years from now, it very well may be. One thing I do like what China is doing in Africa in some aspects, and some of it's controversial, but they are helping Africa build an infrastructure. And if Africa can build an infrastructure, you know, then we have a chance of really seeing Africa blossom. But they've got to get past all of this history of Europeans turning them against one another. Right. And somehow it doesn't have to be totally a nationalistic thing, but it certainly has to be putting their people and their country first.
Yes. Have you visited Africa? Do you visit the country?
No, I've been all over, but I have not. That's one place I want to go to.
Okay. Oh, Doctor, where you from? What part are you from?
Say that again. Oh, you're talking about
Azevedo.
From Mozambique.
Mozambique. Oh my
West
God.
Africa, yes.
I definitely wanted to eventually. I studied in St. Louis and in Dakar.
Senegal. All right.
Yes, that's but I wanted to make 2 points and relate back to you, Dr. Taylor. One was in reference to a Freeman's Bureau. and that we always here on our podcast try to drop some nuggets down.
Okay.
And one research tells us that Mary Ketchum, which was Abraham Lincoln's wife's dressmaker, which was a sister, she was the one that put the concept of the female bureau into Lincoln's thought in the first place, but that it became a vehicle for, like you said, whites, anti-black whites that was anti-black to take advantage of it and benefit from it. But I wanted to ask you a question in reference to, you went back to resistance. And I wanted to ask you a question about doing this as you did elegantly with Ralph Logan and the Native in the Reconstruction period. Can you tell us about, if you have any information reference to that period, when individuals like Henry Adams and others began to talk about, right after that Kushak law in 1876, how they start talking about separation and moving out of this country, or going some parts of this country and getting the land for their own, for themselves. Do you have history on that? Okay.
Well, yeah, and some of that I include in the book. There was a movement from a lot of blacks from the South to Kansas. There was a movement to Oklahoma, and so blacks were, after slavery ended, they were looking just to be just to have some land so they could be self-sufficient, because, like I said, they already had the skill set, and that's why Black Wall Street was so prosperous. But now the native tribes in Oklahoma were responsible for some of the black land and some of the black cities that emerged after the Civil War. And so there's a very rich history that you're going to find, that some of these black cities that were very prosperous started off because of when the U.S. government made some tribal agreements when they ended the Civil War with the native tribes. This was a stipulation of part of that treaty, that they would either take care of black people that were already enslaved in those tribes or give them some land. And so there's a very rich history of that, but blacks have always resisted. And so I don't care what period you pinpoint on that. Even today, that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of a long history of resistance. And until we are free, we're probably going to still continue to resist.
Thanks. Another question, Dr. Sade?
Is there another question?
Yes. I have a question and a statement. First of all, I want to say thank you for taking the time, Dr. Taylor, to share this information with us. I thought it was very informative, very great. I've always said that we are like in a different stage of Reconstruction. Would you agree with that statement? And if you do agree with it, could you tell me exactly what stage we might be in?
I think we've come out of 4 years of questioning, who are we as a nation? What is our identity? And that question almost got answered the wrong way. Now we're still not there by any means, but we now have a chance to put in some stakes to say we won't go back this way. The good thing about it, I used to give a talk about the changing demographics. The changing demographics are on our side in terms of coalition building. Blacks will never be the majority in this country, even looking 50 years out. But based on historical alliances, we have a chance to make some pretty good partnerships and coalition. And we found that out in Georgia, of all places. And we can do the same in California. We can do the same in South Carolina and in other states. And so we have to begin to sort of pick our fights, pick our battles, and say that even if the nation is moving this way, we're going to carve out some space so that there are some alternatives for people to take a look at in this country. So I wish I had the answer to that question. I'm still searching like everyone else, but I do know what I don't want. and I do know what I will support. And so collectively, we've got to come up with an answer to that.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and looks like Steve Williams has his hand raised.
Who does?
Steve Williams.
I guess we'll let him in.
Okay.
Sir. Thank you. And make sure you push the book all over the country now.
Like what I have.
Oh, is that right? Well, thank you.
Well, look what I have here. And the next time I meet you in person, Dr. Taylor, I want an autograph.
Well, thank you. Now that book is out of print, and I was going to have it reprinted, but then when I started writing it, that's when I got starting expanding. Now it's 300 pages.
Well, again, thank you so much. This was such a lovely, this lecture was supposed to only last 30 minutes, but you see, we were so engaged and it was just so informative and just wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just want to, just say again, thanks to everyone for joining us this week. Is that?
Hello, Dr. Sade.
I must stop and let my Reverend Mosley have a word. Go ahead,
I've
sir.
been trying to have a word. I've been trying to say something for about 45 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good evening. I just want to tell the presenter that I thoroughly enjoyed the whole presentation.
Yes.
And I know I enjoyed it because I didn't go to sleep. So, you mentioned something about the Freedmen's Act. A brother brought it to our attention about 10, maybe 12 years or so ago, and we interacted with a Chase Bank in New Orleans, and had some. We thought we were making some headway with him, but there was a brother who was representing Chase, who really his job, as we later found out, was to just act like we was getting somewhere with him, but he really wasn't serious. He was on the side of the bank, but not many folks know about that Freedmen's Act.
Yeah.
So I was glad to hear you say that. And actually, everything I heard you talk about, I've seen or read or seen bits and pieces of it in various movies and documentaries down through the years. So, but you did a great job, brother.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yes. Okay, so if there are no other comments or questions, we're going to go ahead and close it out. And I just want to thank each and every one of you so much for joining us in this week's lecture. I certainly hope, and I know you did, learn some important things about African contributions to American history. Please do spread the word. We do want to build our audience and make this archives available to anyone who wants to use it for any purpose, really informing others, family reunions, church groups, or whatever. And be sure to join us next Sunday, February 28th at 5 o'clock Central Standard Time. Our speaker will be Brother Mwanga Mutu, and he will present Why We Shall Study Our History. Again, this lecture series is presented by KHAFRE, Inc., Local Organizing Committee of Mississippi, and SRF Photography in partnership with Jackson State University's History and Philosophy Department and Juneteenth Festival producers nationwide who are members of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, NJOF. So please join us again every Sunday at 5 o'clock Central Standard Time right here in the Zoom room. Brother Kareem.
And Sade,
Yes.
Dr. Sade,
Yes, sir.
this may or may not be significant at this time, but he did mention something about Oklahoma, and I'm still mammoth about what Doris said the other day. No, the brother said the other day about the Gap Band song, "You Dropped the Bomb on Me."
Are you going to sing us a song as we close out, Minister Mosley?
Oh, you dropped the bomb on me, baby. You dropped the bomb on me. That's a Jack Band song. But I'm glad to learn that it was reality about something really that happened and not just a shake your tail feather song.
That was the Tulsa, the Tulsa bombing on Black Wall Street, right?
Yeah, the Gap.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, Brother Kareem,
Yes,
any closing
indeed.
remarks?
Yeah. Peace and love. Until next time, all things Juneteenth.
Yes, honey.
So long.
All things
Good
Juneteenth.
job,
All things Juneteenth.
Good job. You are such a good addition to the history department.
Say that again.
You are a beautiful addition to the Department of History and Philosophy in Jackson State.
That means I'm getting a raise, y'all. You heard it from, you heard him. You heard him say that.
It's recorded.
It's recorded.
Unquote me now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Acevedo. Again, thank you again for allowing me to do this in partnership with Jackson State. And this is the kind of thing that we want to, in fact, we'll have 3 of our professors presenting in this series as well. And the invitation is to you too, sir. So if you'd like to present one Sunday,
We'll see. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks again for joining us.